Now we'll talk about how to analyze analogical arguments. We've seen what an analogical argument is, but how do you tell whether they're, strong or weak? And what would contribute to the strength of an analogical argument? What would contribute to its weakness? So some arguments from analogy are inductively strong, while some are weak. Here's a strong one. My Toyota Camry and your Nissan Sentra are the same color. My daughter likes the color of my car, therefore my daughter will probably like the color of your car. Okay, so it seems strong, right? Like, we can't really quantify it here, but since she likes the pink on your car, she'll probably like the pink on my car. We're comparing two things, the Toyota Camry and the Nissan Sentra. My car they have all these different things in common, which we didn't list. But my car has this property, that it's liked by, the color of it is liked by my daughter. Therefore, your car will probably have that property, that the color of it is liked by my daughter. Here's a weak analogical argument. My Ford Hybrid and your Hummer are the same color. My vehicle averages 40 miles per gallon of gasoline. Therefore, your vehicle will probably average 40 miles per gallon of gasoline. Okay, so it's weak, obviously, because, they do have a certain characteristic in common. They're both pink. And you can't really infer, though, on that basis that they'll both get good gas mileage. Why? Because the color of a car is irrelevant to the MPGs. Okay, and we'll see that this is a characteristic that needs to hold, a feature that needs to hold for an argument in order for it to be strong. So, the strength of an analogical argument can vary according to 1 and 2, the number and variety of objects being compared in the first premise, and then 3 through 6, the number and relevance of similar characteristics in the objects being compared in the first premise, as well as the number and relevance of dissimilar characteristics. We'll go through each of those in turn. And then we'll look at a few other characteristics as well. Okay, so number 1, now we're going into detail with each of those criteria. The strength of an analogical argument may increase as the number of things referred to in the first premise increases. So here are my examples to try to show the relevance of this criterion. So Sarah's 2010 Toyota Camry had a defective starter, so my 2010 Toyota Camry will have a defective starter. Right, so it's a pretty weak argument simply because Sarah's car, though it's the same make and model year as mine, has a defective starter. It doesn't mean that it's likely that mine will. Maybe like one of the employees in the factory accidentally dropped the starter on the ground and damaged it, and that explains why Sarah's Camry had a defective starter, and mine, along with all the other Toyota Camrys, they don't have defective starters because they weren't dropped. But compare that to this argument. 10,000 2010 Toyota Camrys had defective starters, so my 2010 Toyota Camry will have a defective starter. This is much stronger than the first example. Now it's starting to look like there's some sort of underlying causal mechanism or something, causal origin of the defective starter that's in common with, my car. So, maybe the starter just had a flawed design for the 2010 Toyota Camrys. But the fact that the number of objects being referred to in the first premise increases has an impact on the strength of the analogical argument. Not always, but in this case it does. That's why I say may increase, because it doesn't always mean an increase in the strength of the argument. 2. The strength of an analogical argument may increase if there is some variety or diversity of things being compared in the first premise. So if there are a number of things being referred to in a variety of things. So here's an example of one where, not a large variety of things are being compared. So Mike's dad notices that Mike's friend, who is a surfer, likes a certain surfer shirt. He concludes that his son, who is also a surfer, will like the shirt as well. Okay, so his son is supposed to be Mike, right? But, yeah, so Mike's friend is a surfer and likes this certain surfer shirt. So therefore, Mike will, who is a surfer, will like this surfer shirt. So Mike and the friend are the two things being compared. They have a characteristic in common, that they're surfers. And there's this further characteristic that they're supposed to have, or that Mike is supposed to have, based on Mike's friend having it, that Mike would like this certain shirt. Okay, so that one's okay, but if you increase the variety of things being compared, it can strengthen the argument. So here's a better example. Mike's dad notices that a variety of surfers, old, young, men, women, East Coast, West Coast, etc., they all like a certain surfer shirt. He concludes that his son Mike, who is also a surfer, will like that shirt as well. Okay, so now you know, like, the old surfers, the young surfers, the male surfers, the female surfers, East Coast, West Coast surfers, look, they all like this shirt. That means that probably Mike is going to like it as well. So it increases the chance, the variety increases the chance that the reason all these surfers like this shirt is because they're surfers, right? So with the first example, yeah, Mike and his friend both happen to be surfers, but maybe Mike's friend likes that surfer shirt because it's blue, and Mike doesn't like the color blue at all. Okay? So given that there's not a large variety of things being compared, that decreases the chance that they like the shirt because of the fact that they both are surfers. But with the second example, you have this huge variety, old, young, men, women, East Coast, West Coast, with all these different differences between them. And yet, they all like this certain surfer shirt. So that makes it more likely that the reason that given all their differences, the reason that they like that certain surfer shirt is because of the one thing that they have in common, that they're all surfers. Okay, so the strength of an analogical argument may increase if there is some variety of things being compared in the first premise. Here's another example for 2 in case the surfer one didn't really catch on with you. So here's a one where not a large variety of things are being compared, and I'll compare that to one where a large variety of things are being compared. So experiments show that birth control hormones had an adverse effect on brain development in rats. So those hormones will have an adverse effect on humans. Okay, I mean, that's decent. That's a decent argument. But what if you had this other argument? This other argument's stronger because of the variety of things being compared. Experiments show that birth control hormones had an adverse effect on brain development in rats, rabbits, pigs, and other animals. So those hormones will have an adverse effect on humans. All right, so with the first one, it might be just some very peculiar feature about rats, which has the effect that the birth control hormones have a negative impact on them. And so maybe that peculiar feature is not had by humans. But if you have a large variety of animals all experiencing this adverse effect, it decreases the chance that the adverse effect is the result of some peculiar characteristic had by, say, rats, or rather than rabbits and pigs, right? So it's going to be something that's very general, that they all have in common, and maybe it's just that they're animals, like humans, and so it increases the chance that the hormones will have an adverse effect on humans. Okay, the strength of an analogical argument may increase as the number of characteristics that are claimed to be similar increases. So with 1 and 2, we are dealing with the objects being compared. Now we are dealing with the characteristics that are claimed to be similar. So as the number of characteristics that are similar increases, the strength of the analogical argument may also increase. Take this first example. Phil 101 and Phil 102 are both philosophy classes. Phil 102 was difficult, so Phil 101 will be difficult. Now, the only characteristic they have in common is that they're philosophy classes, right? And you're inferring that because one was difficult, the other one will be so as well. But you can strengthen that by noting further similarities that they both have. They're both philosophy courses taught by the same professor. They have similar papers and tests, and they're highly abstract. Okay. Now you've got a lot to go on to conclude that they'll both be difficult. Alright, so you can see that the number of characteristics that are claimed to be similar, as those increase, the strength of the analogical argument may also increase. But you can't just point out any similarities whatsoever, right? They need to be relevant. So the strength of an analogical argument will increase according to the relevance of the characteristics referred to in the first premise to the characteristic that is inferred. Okay, so the characteristics that are referred to in the first premise need to be relevant to the characteristic that is inferred. So let's just go back to this previous argument. Okay, the characteristic that was inferred was that they were both difficult classes, right? Well, Phil 101, Phil 102 was difficult. That was in the premises, but what we infer is that Phil 101 will be difficult. Whether or not a class is difficult, it's relevant that it's a philosophy course. It's relevant that it's taught by the same professor. It's relevant that they have similar papers and tests. And it's relevant that they're highly abstract. So whether or not they'll both be difficult, it's relevant that they have all these characteristics in common. You know, what if we had said they're both classes? Phil 101 and Phil 102 are both classes, therefore they'll both be difficult. Now, the fact that they're classes is sort of relevant to whether or not they can be difficult, but it doesn't, warrant sort of the conclusion that they'll both be difficult simply because they're both classes. Let's move on to our other example. So we saw this example already. It says, experiments show that birth control hormones had an adverse effect on brain developments in rats. So, therefore, those hormones will have an adverse effect on humans. Now, it is relevant that the hormones had an adverse effect on rats, right? So, it's relevant that they have a similar brain structure. Yeah, my bad. It's relevant that they have a similar brain structure. Okay, so the rats and the humans, their brains are both structured in this certain way, and the hormones had an adverse effect on the brain development in rats, so it'll have an adverse effect on humans. So the brain structure of the rats, if you point that out as a similarity and conclude that, therefore, the hormones will have an adverse effect on humans because it had an adverse effect on rats, well, that characteristic that they have in common is relevant to the conclusion. An irrelevant similarity is that neither rats nor humans have lived to see 2055. Okay, so this one has nothing to do with whether the drug would have an adverse effect on rats as well as humans. Okay, so just because neither have lived to see 2055, it doesn't mean that we conclude anything about what effect this hormone will have on them. Okay, so the strength of an analogical argument will increase according to the relevance of the characteristics referred to in the first premise to the characteristic that is inferred. Okay, now we have criteria 5 and 6. The strength of an analogical argument may decrease according to the number and relevance of dissimilarities or disanalogies between the objects being compared. So if you find a number of dissimilarities and they're relevant, then the strength of the analogical argument will decrease. So my example here is, again, with the rats. Here are some relevant dissimilarities: body size, brain size, complexity of the brain. You know, rats and humans have different sized bodies, different sized brains, and their brains have a different level of complexity. So given these relevant dissimilarities, you might think that, well, just because the hormones had an adverse effect on human rat brains, it doesn't mean that it's going to have an adverse effect on human brains. Okay, so the strength of an analogical argument may decrease according to the number of dissimilarities as well as their relevance. So, you know, if you pointed out a dissimilarity that, what would be an irrelevant dissimilarity? It would be maybe that, I don't know, actually. Rats have tails. That might be irrelevant. And humans do not. Rats have tails and humans do not. So you could point out that dissimilarity, but it's probably not going to impact the strength of the argument. Okay, so you can't just point out dissimilarities. You have to point out dissimilarities that are relevant to the analogy. Okay, now another way to analyze an analogical argument is to provide a counter-analogy. A counter-analogy might undermine the support that the analogical argument provides for the conclusion. So a counter-analogy is a competing analogical argument, one that contradicts the conclusion of the original analogical argument. A counter-analogy is a competing analogical argument, one that contradicts the conclusion of the original analogical argument. So, in order to decide which argument to accept, you must determine which analogy is stronger. So you can analyze an analogical argument or undermine it by providing a counter-analogical argument, one which is a stronger analogy than the original analogy. Let's look at an example. So, consider my original argument and then the counter-analogy. Original argument says, the bones recently found in China are probably human because they match human fossils in the following ways: jawbone structure, teeth, and cranial area. But consider the counter-analogy. These bones are more like an ape-like creature, known to exist at the same time. The slope of the forehead is closer to that of the apes. The eye sockets resemble the apes, as do the cheekbones. These bones are likely to be a newly discovered species of ape. Okay, so the counter-analogy, the original analogy is that these bones resemble human bones. The counter-analogy is that these bones resemble ape bones. Okay, now you have the original argument, and then someone proposes a counter-analogy. You just need to analyze each argument, each analogy, to determine which one is stronger. And the way you would do that is, you're going to need to look at the empirical evidence here in this case. But you're also going to need to look at, all those other features like that we looked at. Relevance of similarities, how many similarities, how many dissimilarities, are those dissimilarities relevant, you're going to need to look at all those things. The number of things being compared, the variety, that type of thing. All right. Once you do that, and suppose you consider that you conclude that the counter analogy is stronger. Well, then you can just ditch the original argument. You've undermined the original argument by providing an analogy that does the trick and that's stronger than the original analogy. Okay, now with the eighth way to analyze an analogical argument, an analogical argument can be undermined by the discovery of unintended consequences of the analogy that are unacceptable to the person presenting the analogy. So, okay, someone gives an analogical argument and you say, hey, you know, if that analogical argument is true, or I mean, if it's strong, it has the following consequences. And the person who gives the argument says, well, I don't like those consequences. Well, then they're going to have to do something here in response. The person must either accept the unintended consequences of the argument or weaken the analogy. However, if she weakens the analogy, she weakens the original argument. Okay, so if you say your analogical argument has the following consequences, and the original person who gave the argument says, I don't like those consequences, they either have to give up the argument, by weakening the original argument so that you no longer can accept it, or they have to accept the unintended consequences even though they don't like them. Here's an example. The bones recently found in China are probably human because they match human fossils in the following ways: jawbone structure, teeth, and cranial area. If they are human, they constitute the oldest evidence of humans ever discovered. So an unintended consequence is, if the bones really are the oldest known evidence of humans, then anthropologists will have to abandon their present theories of where humans originated. This is an unintended consequence of the original argument. Now someone might say, well, I can accept those consequences. Maybe humans originated in a place other than what we originally thought. Or you could say, well, I guess these bones really aren't that human-like, they're more ape-like. But if you do that, you're basically abandoning the original argument. So if an analogical argument has an unintended consequence that you don't like, either you have to accept those consequences or you have to abandon the argument. Okay, as a summary, you can strengthen an analogical argument according to the number and variety of objects being compared in the first premise, or the number and relevance of similar characteristics in the objects being compared in the first premise. The way to undermine an analogical argument is according to the number and relevance of dissimilar characteristics, or the existence of stronger counter-analogies, or unintended and undesired consequences of the original argument. That's the way you analyze analogical arguments. Next week, we will apply that to two different arguments in the philosophical literature. The argument for God's existence based on the design features we see in the universe, and the argument against abortion based on an analogy using a violinist.